worked in Eastern Oregon. He worked for the Grand County Road Department, and he worked around rock crushers. Now, if you know how a rock crusher works, you know, of course, it crushes rocks, and then it sends it up a belt. And the way they get different sizes of rock, they send them through different sieves or grids, right? And when we're talking about grids, we're talking about, you know, wire mesh, and it's more than just mesh, but according to the size of the squares, that's the size of the rock that drops through, right? And so when you want, you know, 4-inch rock, those would be 4 or 5-inch squares, right? And those rocks and everything could drop through. But if you want smaller, you have to have like 3/4 inch minus. It'd be anything 3/4 inch square. And so that grid filters out everything larger, and everything smaller goes through. So all of us have a grid in our mind. It sieves out or filters out the things that we don't know how to deal with and then don't fit our perspective the way we see things ought to be. And what's amazing about it is we do it sometimes unconsciously. And so if we have an outlook on life, and this is the way things ought to be, and something comes along that disagrees with that perspective, we have this uncanny ability to filter it out and just discard it as though it never exists. And you say, well, really? We can? Yeah, we can. And that's why when we're challenged with truth or something that's different than we've been raised to believe, we can choose to either wrestle with it or just dismiss it. Now, the disciples have a problem understanding the truths that Jesus was teaching. Well, yes. In fact, when he is announcing about how he's going to, as the Son of Man, suffer many things and die and be raised from the dead, did they understand that? Not only did they not understand it, they were not willing to even ask him about it. So what are they doing consciously? They're just filtering it out, just dismissing it and not letting it come through the sieve because it doesn't agree with their perspective about how things are supposed to go on. And so Jesus comes, and everything he does challenges people. It challenges them to deal with the truth of who he is and what God is and how they're living their lives. And that's hard. And it's the same challenge you and I have today. So we look at the disciples. They're much like most of the Jews of the day. When they understood Scripture, and we'll talk today about Mark chapter 9, it talks about Elijah who's going to restore all things. Their view of the coming Messiah would be someone that would restore all things. Now, when they're thinking of restoring all things, what are they thinking about in their physical mind? Yeah, don't say a new kingdom, but what? All right, like it used to be. Okay, so here we have the beginning of time where God created the heavens and the earth. And then at Mount Sinai, he entered into a relationship with Israel when he gave them the law. But remember, God spoke to him. His Shekinah, or his glory, descended on that mountain. And out of that came the nation of Israel. And things were great until, well, there's lots of events. One of the events is they said, we want a what? A king. And they said, no, you got a king. But when man rejects God and wants to rule over themselves, Samuel said, hey, you're going to have lots of problems. And they said, it's okay. And they had lots of problems. But it went really south. But the prophets came along and said, don't worry, because God's going to send his anointed one, and he's going to restore all things. And so they're thinking that when the Messiah comes, I'm going to put the cross, and here Jesus claims to be the Messiah, that he's going to restore things to its former glory. But what's God thinking of? Restore what? Let's go back a little farther to right here. What was here? Paradise. Was there any sin? Was there any death? Was there any disease? Was there any evil? No, they didn't even have a knowledge of good and evil. God walked with man on the earth. I mean, you can't get any better than this. And yet sin entered the world, and Satan has been ruling in the lives of men. And when God sent Jesus, his plan was to restore things here, a relationship with God. It skips all this. This just sets up this. But they're thinking purely physical, right? A physical king that's going to be all powerful. And their concept was, if I'm faithful to this king and I honor him and I'm a good servant, he'll put me in a prominent position in his kingdom. Now, is that pretty much the way it goes politically? You know, if you're a good servant or you're, faithful and noble, you'll get a position of honor, okay? That's what they're thinking. We're going to see that also in chapter 9 again. They're discussing who's going to be the greatest among them. And so anytime Jesus counters that perspective by saying something, hey, if you want to be a disciple of mine, you got to what? Deny yourself, pick up your cross, that's the idea of suffering, and then follow me. They don't know how to deal with that. So what do? They don't let it go through their sieve. They just discard it and don't even deal with it. And so when Jesus says he's going to have to suffer many things, they don't deal with it because they don't know how to. Now, as Christians, you think just human beings on this earth, we have sometimes the same struggle. Absolutely. Sometimes we don't know how to deal with things, so we just discard them. And Jesus is always challenging us to look at the truth of who he is and what he wants us to do. And that's why it's very challenging, even presenting this material. So we're looking at the transfiguration and the casting out of this unclean spirit. And so we already looked at verse 1, but now we're at verse 2, where he took them up on the mountain. Who did he take? Peter, James, and John. This is something personal for them and something that Peter remembers himself. And we'll look at that text in 2 Peter chapter 1. We looked at the mountain that he's talking about, but the question we have to ask is, what does this transfiguration teach us? Because it's not just an event like, oh, that's cool, like to see that. No, there's something to be taught us here, just like he's trying to teach the three disciples. And so we'll try to answer that question. Remember, we looked at the sites. Some people say it's Mount Tabor, but probably the best mountain, it would be Mount Hermon, because it was a tall mountain. Here's Mount Tabor. They were up there at Caesarea Philippi, so it just seemed would be natural. Most people would understand it's Mount Hermon. He's up at the top of this mountain, some 9,000 feet high, and that's where this event takes place. So you just get a setting for it. Is there something about being on top of a tall mountain that just creates an environment? Yes, and when you're up there, it's like, whoa, you can see everywhere. It's just majestic in itself. And so when something happens that transcends any of the majestic views physically, it has to be pretty great, right? Because you're up in an amazing spot to start with, and to trump that, it has to be really glorious. Well, and a glorious event's going to take place. And it's where Jesus transforms. So let's read the text, and we'll try to make some sense of it. Glasses. It always helps to have reading glasses. Aha. I always have a spare one in my pocket. Okay. Verse 3. It says, well, at the end of verse 2, he was simply just transfigured before them. And his garments became radiant and exceedingly white, as no launder on earth could whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And he didn't know what to answer, for they became terrified. And then a cloud formed overshadowing them, and a voice came out of the cloud, and it said, my beloved son, hear ye standard your Bible, listen to him. And all at once they looked around, and they saw no one with them anymore except Jesus alone. Now, we're looking at just, 7 verses, and the brevity of this account, just as far as how he details it, probably just cries out for the factualness of it. Because if this was a tale, there's some amazing things going on, aren't there? And so if you're making a fairy tale or a story, you'd probably embellish lots of these events. But it just says he was transfigured. Well, how did that happen? Doesn't even tell you the detail. I would have described, he just started glowing, and you'd go into the right, all the details. He does give a frame of reference. He said it was so white, whiter than Tide could make it, or your favorite laundry soap, right? It was the brightest white you've ever seen. That's all it says. But the impact upon them helps us understand the glory of what they've just seen, okay? So let's try to break this down. Hebrews chapter 1 said he's the radiance of his glory, speaking of Jesus, the exact representation of his nature. And so when he transfigures and he starts shining, we have to go back and think about this event right here at Mount Sinai. Who descended upon the mountain? God. His glory descended upon the mountain. There was lightning and thunder, and the people fell back. Of course, when he spoke, they fell down. But it was God's Shekinah. His glory descended upon the mountain. And the people said, we can't handle this. It is so awesome, so amazing. If he continues to speak to us, what were they afraid it would happen? They'd die. So they request, Moses, you go up on the mountain. We'll just stay down here and take care of things. He goes up there, and when he descends, what do we know about Moses? When he's in the glory, the presence of the glory of God. His face shines. How bright is it shining? They got to put a veil over it. Now, is that the glory of God? No, it's just a reflection of the glory of God when you're in his presence. And so that's what happens. And here we see now on this Mount Hermon, whichever mountain is, Jesus is on the top with Moses and Elijah, and he is shining. What is happening? Is there any connection between the two? At one, God descends and speaks and goes up. Now, God himself has visited the earth. There's a lesson here. We're not just hearing God speak. We're seeing God on the earth. And he's claiming to the three that I'm not just man, but I am God in all his glory, his Shekinah. That's what's happening. Whether you realize it or not, because we just see him, if we were one of the three, in his physical form. At this moment, they get a glimpse of his spiritual majesty. Do you see that? Now, what did they do immediately after? Two things. What brought Moses to come down? What? Do you remember? All right. Well, he's up there with God. They're in disorder and disarray, aren't they? And he has to go down and take care of things. We're going to see something similar when they come off the Mount Transfiguration. Now, immediately after he's done giving all the law and the commandments to Moses, what does he ask them to build? The children of Israel back then. A tabernacle. Now, what does the word tabernacle mean? It's a tent, but it's a tent of meeting. But the word means actually dwell among his people. Now, we know he can't physically because he's too great, but he's going to dwell. His presence is going to be among them, and as long as his presence is among them, they cannot fail. They will just be blessed and succeed. The enemies will never have power over him, but when he leaves, then they're on their own. Now, when they built the tabernacle and they anointed it and the Lord took possession, what happened? Do you remember then? What did it say? The glory of the Lord, his Shekinah, descended upon it. They had to fall back and they just couldn't even enter it. So it was a similar thing. So it's interesting. We find that, Jesus, we see the same thing going on here. And what's the immediate reaction? Now, first of all, Elijah and Moses appear. What's the significance of that? Moses was the first lawgiver, right? Up on this mountain. God spoke to him the 10 commandments plus the 639 other laws, which were written down in the Torah. And that was the law for Israel. He is the lawgiver, God's spokesperson, the prophet. And then Elijah is the icon, if you would, of all the prophets, okay? He was the great prophet that confronted the prophets of Baal and when you think of the prophets, you think of Elijah. So Moses gave the law. When things went south, the prophet said, don't worry, God's going to take care of things. So Jesus is coming, and he's going to fulfill, first of all, everything the prophets promised, and he's also going to show you how to fulfill the law, which Israel all failed miserably. And then also, Jesus is going to be a new or second lawgiver. And so we see that in text. See that in texts such as Acts chapter 3. That's Peter's second sermon, where he says, Moses, speaking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, the Lord God said, Moses said this, and he's quoting now the Old Testament, will raise up a prophet like me from your brethren, to whom you shall give heed to everything he says to you. And it'll be that every soul that does not heed that prophet, speaking of Jesus, this new lawgiver, will be utterly destroyed. And that's interesting. You do not just have mental assent to who Jesus is. Intellectually, you have to accept everything he says as true. And if you do not let his law become the law of your life, you will be dismissed from this world. Yes?
I would suggest, too, that like Moses, who was a deliverer, Jesus is also a second deliverer.
Many parallels led them out of Egyptian captivity. Jesus, same way, exactly. In that text in Acts 3, he goes on to say, after the quote I have there on the board, he says, all the prophets, verse 24, who have spoken from Samuel and his successors onward, also announced these days. So Jesus was prophesied by all these prophets. He's the fulfillment of all of it. What did they say would happen? I'm sending my anointed. What would he do? Yeah, restore all things, but what would he also do? He would suffer. He'd be led like a lamb to a slaughter. And they didn't understand that. Of course, we understand that speaking about restoring relationship with God. They didn't. Jesus fulfilled all the prophets, and he also is the new lawgiver. And all this lesson is being taught imprinted on the three apostles on the Mount Transfiguration. There's so much going on. It's just so much above me to be able to express how big this picture is. From the beginning of time and God's plan, it's being realized right here, and it's just a glimpse. So, I hope you grasp some of this. When it says Moses, Elijah, do you know what they were talking about? I don't add Mark. We've been trying to not go to other gospel accounts, but I just can't help myself here. The parallel account in Luke 9, they're both in chapter 9 of Mark, chapter 9 of Luke. It says Moses, Elijah appeared to him in glory when he was speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Because, again, wouldn't you want to know what they're talking about? If Moses is called out of the grave, back from the heavenlies, and Elijah's called back too, and they appear on the earth again, like, whoa, it's been a while since I've been here. Why'd you call us back? What are they going to talk about? He's talking about Jesus' departure from the earth. What does that mean? Yeah, his crucifixion, but his departure, resurrection, yeah, but when he's done with his work, what's his departure? Going home. He's down here on a mission, isn't he? To restore all things. But what's in the back of his mind after he's done the will of God? I'm here to do your work. It's not like I want to be here. I mean, I do to save man, but this is not fun. And all he's thinking about is what? Going home. I mean, when you just eavesdrop onto this conversation, they're talking about Jesus going home. To me, that's significant. And that should be all our mission. Just get out of here and get home. Because that's real life indeed, is back with the Father. Yes?
Are you saying or thinking that the purpose of the
All right. And that's a good question. The question was, is this for the sole purpose of the apostles? I can't say the sole purpose because if something else is going on, it's not revealed to us. I mean, was this meeting necessary for the mission of Christ? I don't know. All I know is the lessons that are taught the apostles. That's the only thing we can take away from it because that's revealed to us. It's to imprint upon their mind who Jesus is and what their mission is on this earth. So if there's more going on, I don't know, but it seems to be solely for their benefit, okay? So that's the way I will answer that. So Peter, he said, this is kind of weird. He wants to build tabernacles. Now, these would be little booths. They had the Feast of the Booths. These are the little booths or dwelling places. That's what the word tabernacle means for all three of them. And you're like, Peter, where does that come from? Too much bright sun? What are you thinking? But for the person that has a concept of the whole Bible, does it make all the sense in the world? What did they do back here when God's Shekinah descended and he's now going to dwell among them? What did they build? A tabernacle. Now Christ is with us. In Moses and Elijah. Now what is Peter putting them on? All three of them. The same level. He wants to build a dwelling place for all three. Not knowing what he's saying. Now what does that mean? Yeah, he doesn't understand they're not all on the same level. But he assumes because he sees all three together, they must be equal. Is that a fair assumption? When you see Moses, Elijah, I mean, these are the most revered people in Jewish history. Moses and Elijah, and now Christ is there with them. They got to be the same. So let's build a tabernacle down on the valley for all three of you, and you're going to dwell among us, and things will be like they used to be. No. So now what happens? A cloud comes over. This gets eerie. Have you ever been on top of a mountain when a cloud comes over and you can't see anything? I mean, I'm talking about 5-10 feet. Been there. And then you try to get yourself off of it. It's scary. So this cloud comes over, and then on top of that, a voice speaks, and whose voice is it? Just like God spoke back here, he now speaks to the three. How do you know it's God's voice when he's speaking? I'm sorry?
I don't think there's no doubt.
Yeah, when it happens, you have to question. Is it the tenor, the voice, who knows? Does the whole earth shake or the mountain shake when he speaks? I don't know. But when God speaks, do you know it's God? Well, yes, they knew back then. They fell to the ground. And what does God say? They're terrified, and he says, this is my beloved son. Now, we're in the cloud, right? There's three standing. You can't see anything. This is my son. Listen to him. Not Moses, not Elijah. Listen to him. Well, who's the him? The cloud disappears, and who's the only one standing? Did God pick out his son? Did he pick out his anointed one, the chosen one? Could it be any clearer? It's no longer Moses. It's no longer this old Jewish system of law keeping. It's not about the prophets, because Christ is going to fulfill the prophets, keep the law, dismiss them, and then give you a new law. Could it be any clearer? Now, is this transition hard for a Jew? It's huge, because when they filtered it out, the Pharisees couldn't filter it. I mean, they couldn't deal with it, so they filtered it out. It didn't pass through their grid, right? They just rejected everything, because they are stuck on Moses and the prophets, aren't they? And anything that Jesus said that seemed to counter them, they just rejected him entirely, right? And so this is a significant event. If Christ is going to transition them from here into the law of liberty and Christianity, the apostles had to get it, first of all. Does that make sense? So going back to this right here, I think I left one. Oh, yeah. This idea of a tabernacle, John chapter 1, it's interesting. In the beginning was the Word, verse 1, right? The Word was with God. That's way back here. And the Word was God. But then in verse 14, it said the Word became flesh. That's right here. And it says it dwelt among us. You know what that word dwelt means? Tabernacled. It's literally what it means. He tabernacled among us in a physical tent. God dwelt among them in a, tent made out of tent fabric, and then later the temple itself. Jesus tabernacled in a body just like yours and ours, but he was still God in all his glory in the flesh. Now, can you comprehend that if you're a Jew walk on the earth, God in a body? No. How do you have God? And it's been debated ever since. How could Jesus be God but still be man in the flesh? They seem incompatible, and they are. And so the Jews would just, nope, can't deal with that. It doesn't pass through our sieve, our grid, and so they just dismiss it. But the truth of the matter is you're saying Jesus is, and that's what it is. He is God totally, completely in the flesh. They seem incompatible, but that's exactly who he was. Yes?
Yeah, going back to Marlon's question, there is something in this for us too, not just for the apostles, is that what we're told here is the person we listen to is no other prophet. We don't listen to Confucius, we don't listen to Joseph Smith, we don't listen to anybody else. We listen to Christ. There's no other person, no other name under heaven that we're going to listen to.
Exactly. So when we ask the question, what does the Transfiguration teach us? The first lessons are for the apostles. Then there are principles we learn as well from it. But you have to walk away understanding, first of all, Jesus was not just a man. He is God in his total equality. And he walked on this earth in the flesh. Second of all, as you said, he is king. And what he says has to rule in our lives. And when I say rule intellectually, I began with that. A lot of times people say, I don't understand the idea of some of his laws making sense. The last should be the first, and how he thinks certain activities are wrong, homosexuality. Intellectually, it doesn't make sense to me, so I'm not going to agree. Isn't that way a lot of people today are? I don't understand, so I disagree. Or I even heard said worse, if that's what Jesus teaches, since I don't like it, I'm not going to follow Jesus. Whoa, what has that person just done? Elevated himself above the one who just transfigured on the mountain. Aren't they? So a lot of people are willing to assent that Jesus is the Son of God, whatever that means, but intellectually they will not submit to what he teaches as true and incorporate in their life, will they? Because it doesn't pass through their sieve. They don't understand it. And same way with his miracles. They don't want to, he was a good teacher and probably the Son of God, but the miracles, because they can't understand how miracles can happen, so it doesn't pass through their sieve, so they dismiss them. And so now we have an impotent God called Jesus Christ, because he has no real power to change your life, does he? Now, when you think about it, if God created everything, isn't that the premise, our faith, a theist? In the beginning, God created. John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus is back there. If God could create everything, is any miracle possible from then on? I mean, intellectually, if he could speak at all in existence, everything else is a given. Whether you can understand how he could walk on the water or not is immaterial. If you can accept he created, the rest is easy. A lot of times people get hung up on the individual miracle. You're like, what? That doesn't make sense. That's not congruent. You accept that he created, but you challenge the miracle. It makes no sense. And we're going to see that when they get down on off the mountain, this man comes up to Jesus, and what does he say? He's desperate to have his son cured. And he says, if you can. Jesus goes, if I can? What do you mean, if I can? And yet, isn't that the way we operate lots of times? Jesus, little box, because we don't want to submit to him intellectually, and we don't want to submit to his glory. And when we need him, we pull him out and say, Lord, help me, because I'm out of control right now. And then, oh, thank you. And we put him back in his box. And we go on with our life. See, we're not submitting and molding our life to him. We try to use him in our life to make our life easier. And we only do it when we need help. But the rest of the time, I can't deal with him because I don't know what it's like to submit all things to him and deny myself and pick up my cross. So I keep him in the box until I need him. He's not a personal assistant. He's your king. We have to go through this process these three disciples are. Peter, I'd be terrified too. But it's that terror that produces real faith and puts us down the right path. All right. Yes. Yes.
There's 12 apostles, and there were 3 selected for this experience. And if we needed to know, it would be clearly defined. But I'm curious, is there anything as to why these 3 men with some special...
Right. So the question was, for the people who are watching, why the 3 and not all 12 if all 12 needed to hear it? Good question. I really don't have a good answer. We see him picking these 3 many times to do a special healing, up on the mountain, in the garden when he's praying. The rest hear about it, but they don't get to witness it directly. I don't have a good answer. Okay? So, by implication, though, it wasn't necessary for all 12 to be witnesses to the whole world of the resurrection of Christ and who he was as God, the Son of God. It wasn't necessary because they didn't witness it, did they? So it wasn't necessary. So then why did these 3 get it and not the rest? It's a good question. Something we can ponder, right? Okay. All right, so there's the mountain. Peter remembered this. He said, when he received honor and glory from God, this is from 2 Peter chapter 1, and we heard such an utterance that was made to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son whom I well please. We ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. See, Peter remembered it. It served him well. Maybe it's because Peter denies him after being so profound in his allegiance. I'll die for you. And Jesus knows Satan's demanded to sift you like wheat, but I prayed for you. Maybe he needed this special, experience. I don't know. Maybe because Peter's going to have the keys to the kingdom. He needed it. But it's just speculating, right? He opened the doors to both Jews and then Cornelius to the Gentiles. So perhaps he needed it. But then why John and James? I don't know. It's a good question. But it sure made an impression. So here's some lessons. Listen to Jesus. I got to deny myself. Because if you were up on the mountain, that's one thing you would finally come to grips with. It's not about me at all. He is such a glorious, majestic king. I'll just do whatever you ask. Because I've seen who you are. And God has spoken and said, listen to you. I'm going to. And so we're going to deny ourselves and we're going to accept his authority, both intellectually and authoritatively. Whatever you say, we're going to do. Because whether it makes sense or not to me, I know who you are. And then thirdly, I got to act on it. Because if there's no action, there is no acceptance, is there? There's no submission. And that's the essence of Christianity. Jesus said just earlier, if you want to follow me, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and then what? Follow. There's got to be some action on a daily basis. So, real powerful event, right? And we just read through it. Sometimes I have been guilty of it. It's a nice story, and I just miss the implication that's going on. All of history is being set up here or brought to a climax. So they're coming down from the mountain. He says, don't tell anyone till after the resurrection. That's just this common theme. Jesus said, not now, not now, not now. They seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. Do we see a change here in that verse? What are they doing now that's different, Kelly?
They went from, I will trust you entirely, to, okay, now what are you talking about? Maybe you're not making sense anymore, and it's harder to trust you.
Okay, that's not what I kind of see that. But this idea of discussing, what were they doing prior to this when Jesus said something about dying and resurrection? Just totally dismissed it. Not even afraid to ask. Too afraid to ask. Now at least what are they doing? That's what I'm trying to get. Now at least they're talking about it. Their minds have been opened, like, okay, it's undeniable. He has to be God.
So now we got to figure out what that whole.
He's saying he's got to be something we're missing. What is he talking about? The idea of someone dying, being raised, never to die again, has that ever happened? No. There's been resurrection, people died before, and it took God to do it. I'm going to do this myself. So yeah, at least they're entertaining the thought, right? That's a big leap, okay? So they come down and they ask him a question. He said, well, we just saw Elijah. That's what prompted this question. And why is it that says Elijah must come first? And he said, well, Elijah does come and restore all things. Now, who was Elijah when Jesus is speaking of this? Huh? John. And he says that in another text. You can search that out for yourself. John the Baptist came into likeness of Elijah. He was the prophet that prepared the way for Jesus. So Jesus acknowledged that Elijah did come. It was through the person of John the Baptist. So then he comes back with another question. Well, how is it written the Son of Man must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? Probably alluding to Isaiah 53. They knew that scripture too, as well as they knew Malachi saying Elijah's going to come. So he says, yeah, Elijah did come, and maybe expounded on it was John. But then he comes back with another question. Answer this one. They go, yeah, we're working on that one, Lord. We haven't figured it out, okay? I say Elijah has indeed come. They did to him whatever they wished, just as it was written of him. Of course, that means they beheaded him, right? Mankind in general. All right, so we got enough time. This is the most amazing miracle in many aspects because it speaks all the dynamics emotionally and mentally that all of us deal with when we're confronting who Jesus is. And just like when they came off the mountain and they're in disarray, they're worshiping an idol because they're just, they felt alone, right? You know why they did it? Because they said, where's Moses? We're left alone. They said, well, let's build an idol and he'll be our God and he'll direct us. And of course, now they're down partying and playing. There's just disorder, right? Lack of faith, lack of trust. And even though they just heard God speak, well, when they come down from the mountain, look what happens. So we're in verse 33. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, I'm sorry, I'm not the right verse. Verse 14. And when they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them. That would be the 9, right? Because the 3 were with him. And some scribes arguing with him. And immediately, there's our word, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed. They began running up to greet him. So we're done dealing with your disciples. The master's here. That could be a normal response. And he asked them, what were you talking about? He said, what were you discussing with him? And one of the crowd answered and said, Teacher, I brought you my, which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it dashes him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. And I told your disciples, that's a request. I told, he said, heal him, to cast it out, and they could not do it. So what are they talking about? What do you think the discussion is? Why they couldn't do it. I thought you were disciples of the Christ, the great healer. And we've got other people casting out demons in the name of Christ. That'll be later in the chapter. They're not part of the 12. Why couldn't you do it? So now there's doubt upon their authority as disciples of Christ, and also it reflects on the authority and who Jesus is himself, right? This is a big question. It's a lot of turmoil. In fact, it's so, after it's all done and he heals them, what do the disciples come back and say to Jesus? Or ask? Lord, why couldn't we cast them out? So they want to know themselves because it was a puzzling event. Why wasn't this demon subject to us in your name? Good question. So we'll deal with that later. So there's the issue. Gotta love the Lord. Well, he answered and said, oh, unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? And the idea is, how long will I have to put up with you? disdain. It's more frustration, I guess. It's more just seeing his humanity, how this was hard. He had to deal with his own disciples on this level. He constantly are checking them for their lack of faith. And here he's dealing with them as a whole. I mean, he's fed the 5,000, he's fed the 4,000, he's done all these miracles, and they're still what? Unbelieving, doubting. I wonder what he thinks of us when we express the same kind of doubts after all that he has done. So they brought the boy to him, and he saw him. Now here's the boy, and immediately the spirit, that's this demon inside the boy, threw him to the ground in convulsion. Falling to the ground, he began rolling and foaming at the mouth. Would that be just an amazing scene? If you've ever seen someone have a seizure, they do all these things. So sometimes people think this was just an epileptic seizure, but no, it's much more than that. It was the demon that was causing it, even though they're similar. So Jesus asked the Father, there's this interaction. How long has this been happening to him? He said from childhood. And it has often thrown him in both into the fire and to the water to destroy him. Now that's very serious, that it would throw him into fire on purpose, and he had to suffer burns, and into the water to drown him. The demon is trying to kill this boy, and somehow he was rescued each time. But can you imagine the suffering of the parents when they had a child that was burned, third-degree burns, or had to rescue him out of the water? So he says, both in the fire and the water, and here it is in the middle of verse 22, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Now, on one hand, that prayer is beautiful. The second half, what? Take pity. Isn't that all we're asking? God, have compassion on us. And we know he's a God of compassion. And if we run to him, he will have compassion, and he will take compassion, and he'll help us. The first part is what Jesus gets so dismayed at when he said, if you can do anything. But from the Father's perspective, he said, hey, I've tried. I've been to the doctors. I've tried everything that everyone's asked me to do. I even brought them down to your disciples. Nobody has been able to do anything. So if you can do anything, it would help. You understand that question? How he asked it from the perspective he's from? So we'll give him a little break. But Jesus is just coming from another perspective. You don't understand who you're asking. I created the heavens, the earth. If I can. Well, that's what he's going to come back with. So we'll read this and then finish there. Verse 23, and Jesus said to him, if you can, all things, we'll have to qualify that next week, are possible to him who believes. And here's the profound thing that should be our prayer. Immediately the boy's father cried out and began saying, I do believe. Here's the prayer, what? Help me in my... And that's my trust, my lack of trust. I believe, Jesus, who you are, but I don't trust you like I should. Help me in my faith. And when Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again. And after crying and throwing him into the last fit of convulsion, he came out. And the boy became so much like a corpse, they all said, he's dead. That's how he just laid there. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him up, and he got up. And we come into the house, the disciples began questioning, why couldn't we cast it out? He said, this only comes out by prayer. The other text with fasting and prayer. All right, we'll pick it up, Lord willing, next week. Okay.